The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Atlanta International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The bustling terminal was already alive with travelers rushing to their destinations, but something special was about to unfold at the premium check-in area. The Richardson family made their way through the airport's main entrance, their designer luggage gliding smoothly across the floor. Mr. Richardson, one of the country's top brain surgeons, walked with quiet confidence rather than showing off. His white linen shirt and tailored black pants spoke of money well spent, but it was his kind eyes and gentle smile that really caught people's attention. Next to him, Mrs. Richardson typed something quick on her phone before slipping it into her Channel bag. As the owner of a company that made new medical tools, she was always getting messages about her latest inventions. She wore a simple but elegant blue summer dress that matched the clear sky outside, her natural hair styled in a sophisticated updo that turned a few heads. Their kids was something else entirely. Their son, now 14, had his nose buried in a book about chess strategies. He was getting ready for a big tournament next month, and even the excitement of their private jet couldn't pull him away from studying his next moves. His little sister, 12 years old and sharp as a tack, was telling their mom about her latest science project, something about using computers to help doctors work better. "Dad," the girl said, her eyes lighting up with an idea, "what if we made a computer program that could help you during those really long surgeries? Like a smart assistant?" She adjusted her pink backpack, nearly bumping into a passing traveler in her excitement. Mr. Richardson chuckled, gently steering his daughter clear of another rushing passenger. "That's actually a really good idea, sweetheart. Why don't you tell your mom about it? She might even help you make it real." Mrs. Richardson smiled proudly at her daughter. "Maybe we can work on that during the flight. We've got plenty of time before we land in Switzerland." She checked her watch. A birthday gift from her husband that probably cost more than some cars. The family was heading to a big medical conference in Switzerland, where both parents were going to give talks about their work. Mr. Richardson was going to tell other doctors about his new way of doing brain surgery that helped kids get better faster. Mrs. Richardson was showing off her company's latest invention, special tools that made surgery safer and easier. As they walked toward the premium check-in area, their luggage creating a soft wheeling sound against the floor, other travelers couldn't help but notice them. It wasn't just their designer clothes or their obvious success, it was the way they carried themselves, the way they smiled at passing airport staff, the way the parents actually listened when their kids talked instead of just nodding along. The morning light caught Mrs. Richardson's wedding ring as she reached for their passports, making it sparkle. The ring had a story behind it. Mr. Richardson had saved up for months during his medical school days to buy it. Now he could afford much fancier ones, but she never wanted to replace it. "Some things are worth more than money," she always said. Their daughter skipped ahead a little, her braids bouncing with each step, while their son finally looked up from his chess book long enough to avoid walking into a pillar. Mr. Richardson carried their carry-on bags, refusing help from the airport staff who offered. His mother had taught him to always carry his own weight when he could. They were almost at the premium check-in counter now, where their private flight crew would be waiting. The kids were excited about flying on their jet again, though they tried to act cool about it. Their parents had taught them that having nice things wasn't as important as being nice to people. Little did they know that their ordinary morning at the airport was about to become very unusual indeed. Someone was watching them approach the premium line, and this person had already made up their mind about exactly who and what this family was or wasn't. The next few minutes would test their patience, showcase their grace, and ultimately teach everyone at the airport a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers. That's when everything changed. A woman in her late 50s, wearing an expensive beige pantsuit and sporting a "Can I speak to your manager" haircut, had been watching the Richardson family like a hawk from the moment they entered the premium check-in area. Her designer handbag swung wildly as she power-walked towards them, her face already twisted into an expression of what she probably thought was righteous concern. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying across the terminal like a foghorn. Several nearby travelers winced at the volume. "Excuse me, but I think you're in the wrong line. The regular check-in is over there." She pointed dramatically toward the economy section, her pearl bracelet jingling with the motion. Mr. Richardson took a deep breath, the kind he usually reserved for particularly challenging surgeries. His kids shared a knowing look. They'd seen this movie before, though it never got easier to watch. Mrs. Richardson's hand found her husband's, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Actually, ma'am," Mr. Richardson began politely, his voice calm and measured, "we're in exactly the right line. Thank you for your concern." He turned back to his family, hoping that would be the end of it. But the woman wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "No, no, no," she insisted, stepping directly into their path. "This is the premium line, for first class and private flights." She emphasized these words as if explaining something very simple to very small children. "I just don't want you to waste your time in the wrong line." Their daughter shifted uncomfortably, clutching her science project notebook closer to her chest. Their son put a protective arm around his sister's shoulders, his chess book temporarily forgotten. Mrs. Richardson pulled out her phone, quietly beginning to record. Experience had taught them the value of documentation. "Ma'am," Mrs. Richardson said firmly but politely, "we are very aware of where we are. Now, if you'll excuse us—" "Listen," the woman interrupted, her voice getting louder, drawing even more attention. "I fly first class all the time. I know who belongs in this line and who doesn't." She glanced pointedly at their designer luggage, as if suggesting it must be fake. "I'm just trying to help you avoid embarrassment." A small crowd had started to gather, some people pretending to check their phones while obviously watching the scene unfold. Others were more blatant, already holding up their phones to record what was happening. Mr. Richardson stood a little straighter, his full height impressive but not intimidating. Years of dealing with difficult situations in the operating room had taught him how to remain professional under pressure. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you think you're doing, but you're making assumptions that are both incorrect and inappropriate." The woman's face flushed red. "Well, I never. I'm going to get a manager right now. Someone needs to handle this situation." She emphasized the word situation while frantically looking around for airport staff. Their son, still holding his sister, whispered, "Dad, our flight crew is probably waiting." His voice trailed off as he noticed more people gathering to watch. Mrs. Richardson continued recording discreetly, her law school background before switching to biotech reminding her to document everything. She'd seen too many similar incidents go unchecked because there wasn't any proof. The woman was now waving her arms, trying to flag down any airport employee she could find. "Security, manager. Someone needs to come here right now." Her voice echoed through the terminal, causing several babies to start crying and other travelers to shake their heads in disapproval, though it wasn't clear if they were disapproving of her behavior or the situation in general. Through it all, the Richardson family maintained their dignity. The parents exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They'd been here before, would likely be here again, and knew exactly how to handle it. Their children stood tall beside them, unfortunate experts at dealing with such situations despite their young age. The woman's next words came out in a rush, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "These people see and be in the right line. I know they're not flying private. Someone needs to escort them to the correct area right now." Little did she know, but her very public display of prejudice was about to backfire in the most spectacular way. As she continued her tirade, a familiar face was already making their way through the crowd, someone who knew exactly who the Richardsons were and what they were worth, both as people and as professionals. The next few moments would become a viral sensation, though that wasn't what the Richardsons wanted. They just wanted to catch their flight to Switzerland, where Mr. Richardson would be presenting his groundbreaking pediatric surgery techniques, and Mrs. Richardson would be unveiling her company's latest medical innovation. But sometimes life has other plans. Plans that involve teaching very public lessons about very private prejudices. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Other travelers had completely given up pretending not to watch, and phones were recording from every angle. But the Richardson family remained calm. They turned these ugly moments into teaching opportunities before, and they would do it again. "Look," Mr. Richardson said, his voice carrying the same steadiness he used when explaining complicated procedures to nervous parents. "I understand you think you're helping, but you're disrupting our morning and upsetting my children. We have a flight to catch, and we're exactly where we need to be." The The woman's face twisted into an expression of disbelief. "Oh, really? You expect me to believe that you're flying, Pa?" "Mom," the daughter interrupted, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Can I show her my science fair trophy? Maybe if she sees." Mrs. Richardson gently shook her head. "No, sweetie. We don't need to prove anything to anyone." She turned to her son, who was still protectively standing near his sister, but looked ready to say something he might regret. "Remember what we talked about? Our actions speak louder than words." The boy took a deep breath and nodded, though his chess book was now gripped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He'd won countless tournaments by keeping his cool under pressure, and he wasn't about to lose his composure now. The woman wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone, making a show of dialing numbers. "I'm calling corporate right now. I've been a platinum member for 15 years, and I've never seen such a—" "Ma'am," Mrs. Richardson cut in, her voice firm but professional, "you're making a scene based on assumptions that say more about you than they do about us. My children are watching how I handle this situation, so I'm going to be very clear. Your behavior is inappropriate, and you need to step away." Several onlookers nodded in approval, but the woman seemed to take their attention as encouragement. "Oh, now you're threatening me. Security, this family is threatening me." Mr. Richardson sighed, checking his watch. They needed to be boarding soon to make it to Switzerland in time for the conference's opening ceremony. His presentation on revolutionary pediatric surgery techniques was scheduled for the first morning, and jet lag was already going to be a challenge. Their daughter, still clutching her science notebook, whispered to her brother, "Do you think this is going to end up like that time at the country club?" He shook his head. "Nah, that lady at least apologized when she found out Dad owned the place. This one seems different." The woman overheard their whispered conversation and scoffed loudly. "And there, now I know where you're making things up. I'm calling security right now." She emphasized each word by jabbing her finger in the air. Mrs. Richardson, still recording discreetly, caught a glimpse of movement behind the woman. A familiar face was approaching, someone who could end this whole situation. But before they arrived, the woman launched into her loudest tirade yet. "Everyone," she announced to the growing crowd, "these people are trying to sneak into the premium line. They're probably going to try to sneak onto someone's private jet." She turned to other well-dressed travelers nearby, seeking allies. "We can't just let people walk in here and—" Actually, came a new voice from behind her. "I think we need to discuss your behavior." The woman spun around, ready to recruit this new voice to her cause. But the words died in her throat as she saw who was standing there. The next few moments would change everything, though not in the way she expected. Throughout all of this, the Richardson children had been exchanging looks that spoke volumes. They'd seen this before, at restaurants, at their private school events, even at medical galas where their parents were being honored. But this time felt different. Maybe it was because of all the phones recording, or maybe it was because their parents seemed more determined than ever to turn this into a teachable moment. Their daughter pulled out her science project notebook, the one filled with ideas about using artificial intelligence in surgery, inspired by watching her father work. She'd been planning to review her presentation during the flight, but now she was writing something else: how to stay calm when others aren't. Even at her young age, she knew she was witnessing something worth documenting. The boy had finally set down his chess book, but his mind was still thinking in terms of strategy. He could see all the possible ways this could play out, just like on his chessboard. But unlike chess, this wasn't a game. This was real life, with real consequences, and his parents were showing him, once again, how to handle it with grace. The crowd had grown larger, and whispers were spreading. Someone had recognized Mr. Richardson from a recent medical journal cover. Another person was pointing at Mrs. Richardson, remembering her from a tech innovation magazine. The truth was about to come out, but the Richardsons weren't interested in public embarrassment, even for someone who clearly deserved it. They just wanted to catch their flight and continue their work of making the world a better place. Little did anyone know, but this moment, captured on dozens of phones from dozens of angles, was about to become something much bigger than a simple airport confrontation. It would spark conversations in homes and offices across the country, making people think twice about their own assumptions and biases. But for now, all eyes were on the next person about to speak, and the words they would say would change everything. A hush fell over the crowd as the airport's lead customer service representative stepped forward. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a crisp uniform with a gold name badge that caught the morning light. Her purposeful walk and professional demeanor immediately commanded attention. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though the look in her eyes suggested she already knew exactly what was happening. She'd been watching the situation unfold on the security cameras, taking her time to approach because she knew exactly who the Richardson family was. The woman in the beige pantsuit practically jumped with relief. Yes, finally, someone with authority. These people, she gestured dramatically at the Richardson family, are trying to use the premium check-in area. I've been trying to explain to them that they're in the wrong place, but they won't listen. The customer service representative's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. She'd handled similar situations before, but this one was about to become particularly satisfying. "Ma'am," she addressed the woman calmly, "I need you to step back and lower your voice." Then, turning to the Richardson family, her whole demeanor changed. "Dr. Richardson, I apologize for this interruption. We've been expecting you and your family. Your flight crew called ahead to let us know you were on your way." The woman's mouth dropped open, but she wasn't done yet. "There must be some mistake. You can't mean, they can't possibly." "Dr. Richardson," the representative continued, deliberately ignoring the interruption, "I actually attended your lecture last month at the medical convention here in Atlanta. Your work on pediatric neurosurgery is groundbreaking. My nephew benefited from your technique last year." She turned to Mrs. Richardson. "And Mrs. Richardson, your company's new surgical tools have revolutionized how we approach minimally invasive procedures. We're honored to have you both flying through our airport." The crowd began murmuring. Several people were frantically Googling on their phones, and you could see the moment they found the articles about the Richardsons, their eyes widening, some gasping softly. The woman in beige stood frozen, her face cycling through various shades of red. But I didn't. Your private jet is ready whenever you are." The representative continued, speaking to the Richardsons. "Would you like an escort to the terminal? I know your daughter," she smiled at the young girl, "was interested in seeing the control tower after her science project on aviation technology won first place at the state fair." The daughter's face lit up. "You remembered. Dad, can we? Please?" The woman in beige was now frantically scrolling through her own phone, presumably finding the same articles everyone else had discovered. Her hands were shaking slightly. "These are our VIP guests," the representative addressed the crowd firmly, "and I believe this situation has taken up enough of their valuable time." She turned to the woman in beige, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me. We have a strict policy against harassing our passengers, and we need to discuss your behavior." Mr. Richardson raised his hand slightly. "That won't be necessary. We don't want to cause any more disruption." He looked at the woman in beige, not with anger but with something closer to compassion. Sometimes the best response to an unfortunate situation is to learn from it and do better next time. Mrs. Richardson nodded in agreement, though she kept her phone recording, not for revenge, but because moments like these needed to be documented for the greater conversation about prejudice and assumptions. Their son, who had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Mom, Dad, remember what Grandma always says? The best revenge is living well." He smiled at his parents. "I think she'd be proud of how you handled this." The representative gestured toward a private elevator. "Your flight crew is waiting." And she glanced at her watch. "If we head up now, we should have just enough time for a quick tour of the control tower before your departure." As the family gathered their belongings, the crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached to apologize on behalf of the woman in beige, who was now sitting on a nearby chair, looking shell-shocked. The daughter, ever the scientist, was already making notes in her project book. "Mom," she whispered, though not quietly enough, "I think I just found the topic for my next social science project, How Assumptions Cloud Judgment, a case study in airport interactions." Mrs. Richardson couldn't help but smile. Even in difficult moments, her children found ways to learn and grow. She made a mental note to help her daughter develop that project. It could be important research for the future. As they walked toward the private elevator, Mr. Richardson's phone buzzed. It was a message from the conference organizers in Switzerland, confirming his keynote speech about making advanced medical care accessible to underserved communities. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, dealing with prejudice at home, while preparing to talk about breaking down barriers abroad. The representative swiped her access card, and the elevator doors opened smoothly. As the family stepped inside, they could still see the woman in beige through the closing doors, now surrounded by airport security who were apparently having a serious discussion with her about appropriate behavior in the terminal. The last thing the gathering crowd heard before the elevator doors closed was the daughter's excited voice. "Do you think we can see our jet from the control tower? And can I ask the controllers about their radar systems? I have some ideas about improving air traffic patterns using AI." The private aviation terminal was a world away from the main airport's hustle and bustle. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the airfield, where several private jets stood gleaming in the morning sun. The Richardson's jet was easy to spot, its sleek white exterior decorated with their Medical Foundation's logo, a symbol of hope for thousands of families who'd benefited from their charitable medical programs. The woman in beige hadn't given up just yet. She'd somehow managed to follow them, pushing past security and waving her platinum frequent flyer card like it was a badge of authority. "This has gone far enough," she called out, her voice echoing through the private terminal's marble lobby. "I demand to speak to whoever's in charge of." She stopped mid-sentence, her jaw dropping as she took in the scene before her. Through the glass walls, she could clearly see the ground crew preparing the Richardson's private jet. The pilot and co-pilot were walking toward the terminal, their uniforms crisp and professional, heading straight for the family she'd been harassing. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson," the pilot called out warmly, "we're all set for departure. The weather looks clear all the way to Switzerland." He nodded respectfully to the children. "And I heard someone was interested in seeing the cockpit." The daughter's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? We can see inside?" "Of course," the co-pilot smiled. "We heard about your science project on aviation technology. Maybe you can tell us more about your ideas during the tour." The woman in beige stood frozen, her platinum frequent flyer card slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. Her face had gone from red to pale as she watched several ground crew members carefully loading the family's designer luggage into the jet's cargo hold. But that wasn't what finally made her speechless. It was the group of people who had just rushed into the terminal, a medical team in scrubs, looking anxious. "Dr. Richardson," one of them called out, "we're so sorry to disturb you before your flight, but we needed to catch you. That new surgical technique you developed, we just used it this morning on a 7-year-old patient. It worked exactly like you said it would. The child's parents wanted you to have this before you left." They handed over a handmade thank you card, clearly crafted by small hands still recovering from surgery. Mr. Richardson took it carefully, touching it like it was made of gold. These were the moments that meant everything to him, not the private jet, not the designer clothes, but knowing he'd made a difference in someone's life. Mrs. Richardson was already wiping away tears as she read the card over her husband's shoulder. Their son had his arm around his sister, both of them smiling proudly at their parents. This was a regular occurrence in their lives, not the airport drama, but the reminders of why their parents worked so hard. That's impossible," the woman in beige muttered, but no one was paying attention to her anymore. The terminal staff were too busy greeting the Richardsons like the VIPs they were, while the medical team was showing Mrs. Richardson photos of their surgical department using her company's newest equipment. Through the windows, more airport workers had gathered around their jet. Word had spread about what happened in the main terminal, and they wanted to show their support. Some were taking photos of the Foundation's logo on the tail. It had become a symbol of hope in the medical community, representing the Richardsons' commitment to making advanced healthcare accessible to everyone, regardless of their background or ability to pay. The daughter had already pulled out her notebook again, peppering the pilots with questions about aerodynamics and flight paths. The son was explaining chess strategies to a fascinated ground crew member who'd recognized him from a recent tournament coverage in the local paper. "Your flight plan is approved," the terminal manager announced, walking over with a tablet. "And Dr. Richardson, our staff wanted you to know, the pediatric wing you funded at City Hospital saved my grandson last year. What you and your wife do, it matters. It really matters. The woman in beige had sunk into one of the terminal's plush chairs, her face a mask of embarrassment and shock. Her phone was buzzing constantly now. Apparently, videos of her behavior in the main terminal had already started circulating online. But Mr. Richardson, ever the professional, walked over to her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I hope today has taught you something valuable. Success doesn't look one way, and assumptions can prevent us from seeing the truth about people. My wife and I have dedicated our lives to helping others, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Maybe you could try doing the same." A crowd had gathered outside the terminal windows: airport staff, passengers from other private jets, even some of the security team who'd been called earlier. They weren't there to gawk or judge. They were there because the Richardsons had touched many of their lives through their medical work, their charitable foundation, or simply through their kindness. As the family walked toward their jet, Mrs. Richardson turned to their children. "Remember this day," she said softly. "Not because of what happened in the terminal, but because of how we handled it. Sometimes the best way to change minds isn't through confrontation, but through example." The sunlight caught the Foundation's logo on their jet, making it shine like a beacon. In a few hours, they would be in Switzerland, sharing their medical innovations with the world. But right now, they had unknowingly delivered a different kind of lesson, one about dignity, grace, and the danger of jumping to conclusions. The videos spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time the Richardsons' private jet reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic, their airport experience had gone viral on every social media platform imaginable. Phones across the country lit up with notifications as the clips spread like wildfire. The first video, shot by a college student waiting for his economy flight, showed the initial confrontation. "Watch this family handle pure ignorance with total class," read the caption. The comments section filled up quickly. "That's Dr. Richardson. He saved my little sister's life last year. Wait till she finds out who they are." "The way they stayed calm. That's real class right there." Another angle, captured by a business traveler, focused on the children's reactions. The boy protecting his sister, both of them standing tall beside their parents. It sparked discussions about how children learn to handle difficult situations by watching their parents' examples. A third video, recorded by a flight attendant on break, caught the moment when the airport representative revealed who the Richardsons were. The woman in beige's face journey, as people called it online, became an instant meme. But most comments focused on the family's grace under pressure. By mid-afternoon, major news networks had picked up the story. Their broadcasts weren't just about the airport incident. They delved into the Richardsons' background, revealing a history of groundbreaking medical work and charitable contributions that left viewers amazed. "Breaking Barriers in Medicine and Society," one headline read. The segment showed clips of Mr. Richardson performing complex surgeries that had saved countless children's lives. They interviewed parents of his patients, their tearful testimonies painting a picture of a doctor who cared more about helping people than making money. Another network focused on Mrs. Richardson's journey from law school to medical technology innovation. "She saw a problem in surgical procedures and decided to fix it," the reporter explained, showing footage of her company's devices being used in hospitals worldwide. The story highlighted how her innovations had made certain surgeries 40% faster and 60% safer. Social media couldn't get enough of the children either. Someone dug up footage of the son's recent chess tournament victory, where he donated his prize money to fund chess clubs in underprivileged schools. The daughter's science fair project on medical AI went viral in tech circles, with major tech companies praising her innovative thinking. The family's charitable foundation became a hot topic. People shared stories of how the Richardsons had helped their communities. The free medical clinics they'd funded, the scholarships they'd provided for minority medical students, the research grants they'd given to develop affordable medical solutions for developing countries. "This is why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover," wrote a popular commentator, sharing split-screen images of the airport confrontation and the family's humanitarian work. While someone was making assumptions about them, they were literally on their way to share medical breakthroughs that could save thousands of lives. By evening, the incident had sparked serious discussions about prejudice in everyday life. News panels featured experts discussing how successful black professionals often faced similar situations. The comment sections, usually battlegrounds of disagreement, showed rare unity in condemning the woman's behavior and praising the family's response. The woman in beige's employer, a major corporation, released a statement distancing themselves from her actions. "This behavior does not reflect our company's values," they wrote. The internet quickly found out she served on several charitable boards, all of which were suddenly facing questions about their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But through it all, the Richardsons remained focused on their work. Landing in Switzerland, they were surprised to find reporters waiting. The story had gone international. But Mr. Richardson just smiled and said, "We're here to share medical innovations that could help people everywhere. That's what matters." Their daughter's response to a reporter's question about the incident went viral too. "My parents always say that the best way to prove people wrong is to keep doing what's right," she said, clutching her science notebook. "I just wish that lady had asked about my project instead of making assumptions. Maybe she would have learned something cool about brain surgery." The Sun's Chess Club posted a statement. "Our champion teaches us that life, like chess, requires thinking several moves ahead. Today, he and his family showed us that the best move isn't always the most aggressive one." Medical students across the country shared the videos in their study groups. "This is the kind of doctor I want to be," wrote one student, "not just skilled in medicine, but in handling difficult situations with grace." By nightfall, the incident had become more than just another viral moment. It had turned into a conversation about excellence, dignity, and the importance of breaking down stereotypes. Fundraising for the Richardsons' Medical Foundation skyrocketed as people wanted to support their mission. But perhaps the most powerful response came from a young black girl who posted a video of herself wearing a toy stethoscope. "When I grow up, I want to be like Mrs. Richardson, not just because she's successful, but because she's kind even when others aren't. That's real success." The family's response to all this attention? A simple post from their foundation's account. "Thank you for the support. Now, let's focus on what really matters, making healthcare better for everyone." Attached was a link to their new initiative for bringing advanced medical care to underserved communities. 3 months after the airport incident, life had mostly returned to normal for the Richardson family. The viral videos had faded from the daily news cycle, replaced by newer stories. But the impact of that day was about to come full circle in an unexpected way. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the woman in beige rushed into City Hospital's emergency room. Her granddaughter had fallen during a soccer game, and the initial scans showed possible brain trauma. As she paced the waiting room, her designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest, she couldn't help but overhear the nurses talking. "The best pediatric neurosurgeon is on call today," one nurse whispered to another. "That little girl couldn't be in better hands." The woman managed a weak smile, grateful for this small comfort. But that smile froze on her face as she looked up at the wall of distinguished surgeons and saw a familiar face. Dr. Richardson, the same man she'd confronted at the airport, was heading the surgical team that would operate on her granddaughter. Her legs went weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. The memory of that day came flooding back. Her loud accusations, her absolute certainty, her very public humiliation when she'd been proven wrong. And now, the man she treated so poorly was about to operate on her precious granddaughter. A nurse approached with admission papers. "Mrs. Clark," she said gently, "Dr. Richardson would like to speak with you about the procedure." The woman's hands trembled as she signed the forms, her expensive pearl bracelet clicking against the clipboard. Moments later, Dr. Richardson walked into the waiting room. He looked exactly as he had that day at the airport, calm, professional, and carrying himself with quiet dignity. The woman started to speak, but he raised his hand gently. "Mrs. Clark," he said, his voice kind but professional, "right now we need to focus on your granddaughter. She has a subdural hematoma that requires immediate attention. I'm going to use a minimally invasive technique that I developed specifically for pediatric cases. The success rate is very high, and the recovery time is significantly shorter than traditional methods." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. "Dr. Richardson, that day at the airport, I need to." He interrupted her gently. "Mrs. Clark, we can discuss that later if you'd like. Right now, your granddaughter needs us to focus on her care. I promise you, she'll receive the exact same world-class treatment every child deserves in my operating room." As he turned to leave, she called out, "Why? Why would you help us after how I treated you?" Dr. Richardson paused at the door. "Because that's what doctors do, Mrs. Clark. We help people, all people. And maybe, just maybe, this experience will teach us both something valuable about judging books by their covers." He smiled warmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a young athlete who needs my help." The surgery lasted 4 hours. During that time, Mrs. Clark noticed things she'd been too angry to see at the airport. She saw the wall of thank you cards from families Dr. Richardson had helped. She read about the medical foundation he and his wife had started. She watched families of all backgrounds come and go, all receiving the same exceptional care. When Dr. Richardson finally emerged from surgery, his warm smile told her everything before he even spoke. "Your granddaughter is going to be just fine," he said. "She's already asking when she can get back to soccer." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by shame. "Dr. Richardson," she began, her voice shaking, "I need to apologize. That day at the airport, I was so wrong. Not just about who you were, but about who I was being." He nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Clark, do you know why I became a doctor?" When she shook her head, he continued, "Because illness doesn't care about the color of your skin, your clothes, or your bank account. Pain doesn't check your social status before it strikes. And healing, well, healing is something everyone deserves." 3 weeks later, Mrs. Clark stood at a podium at a charity event for the Richardson Medical Foundation. Her granddaughter, fully recovered, stood beside her. "I learned something important," she told the crowd, her voice clear and strong. "Excellence doesn't look like what we might expect. Success doesn't have a specific face, and sometimes our greatest teachers are the very people we wrongly judge." That day, she announced a significant donation to the Foundation's program for bringing advanced medical care to underserved communities. But more importantly, she shared her story, not as a victim of public shaming, but as someone who'd learned a valuable lesson about prejudice and redemption. The Richardson children were in the audience that day. The daughter leaned over to her brother and whispered, "Remember what Dad always says. Sometimes the best medicine isn't the one you give, but the one you inspire others to give." As the event ended, Mrs. Clark approached the Richardson family. This time, there was no judgment, no assumptions, just gratitude. "You didn't just save my granddaughter," she said softly. "You saved me from my own prejudices, and that might be the greater miracle." Dr. Richardson smiled and shook her hand. "The greatest surgery we can perform," he said, "is the one that opens people's minds and hearts. Sometimes it takes a difficult moment to create a beautiful change." The story made the rounds on social media again, but this time with a different message. It wasn't about public shaming or viral outrage. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the power of meeting ignorance with grace. It was about how one family's dignity in the face of prejudice didn't just change one person's mind, it sparked a conversation that continued to change many more.